The brutal ending of Bob Ford is a documented history of premeditated betrayal and absolute physical retaliation. In 1882, to collect a state bounty, Ford assassinated an unarmed Jesse James by shooting him directly in the back of the head. Expecting fame, Ford instead faced extreme national hatred that drove his accomplice brother to suicide. A decade later, the betrayal was met with fatal ballistic trauma. In 1892, an assailant entered Ford's saloon, greeted him, and instantly executed him with a double-barreled shotgun blast to the throat. This is the cold, physical reality of frontier justice. It was 8 o'clock on a quiet spring morning, April the 3rd, 1882, in the small wooden house at 1318 Lafayette Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. The air inside still carried the faint smell of coffee and bacon from breakfast. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the pine floorboards. A man known to his neighbors as Thomas Howard stood in the middle of the parlor wearing house slippers and no boots. He had just unbuckled his heavy gun belt and laid the revolvers carefully on the bed, something he rarely did. The day felt warm for early April, or perhaps he simply felt safe enough in that moment to let his guard down. He noticed a framed piece of needlework hanging crooked on the wall, a simple picture his mother had stitched years earlier. He stepped up onto a chair to straighten it, his back turned to the room. Two young men he had come to trust like brothers watched him from a few feet away. Robert Newton Ford, 20 years old, thin and wiry, stood perfectly still. His older brother Charlie was beside him. Bob's hand moved slowly toward the Colt revolver tucked in his waistband, the same gun Jesse James himself had once given him as a token of friendship. The hammer clicked back with a soft metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have in the stillness. Jesse heard it and began to turn his head. The shot cracked through the small room like thunder in a closed space. Jesse pitched forward off the chair and hit the floor before the echo died. Blood spread quickly across the boards. For one frozen second, the only sound was the distant call of a morning bird outside the window. Bob and Charlie did not linger. They ran out the back door, jumped the low fence, and began shouting to the neighbors in voices that carried down the street. "We've killed Jesse James! We've killed Jesse James!" They kept running all the way to the telegraph office to send the news to the governor and claim the reward they had been promised. Behind them, in the quiet house, Zerelda James rushed in from another room and found her husband dead on the floor. She screamed his real name for the first time in months. The ordinary Tuesday morning had ended one of the most famous lives in America and begun the long, bitter story of the man who pulled the trigger, stepping back into the world that shaped both the killer and the killed perfectly, exposes why that single gunshot still echoes more than a century later. Stripped of any romantic Wild West mythology found in dime novels, post-Civil War Missouri operated strictly as a deeply fractured border state that had never quite healed. Families had been torn apart by guerrilla warfare that made the official battles seem almost civilized by comparison. Neighbors burned each other's barns, shot each other from ambush, and carried grudges that lasted decades. The James family farm in Clay County had been raided by Union troops during the war. Jesse and his brother Frank had ridden with Bloody Bill Anderson and Quantrill's raiders, learning early that violence could be a way of life when you felt the government had betrayed you. After the war, when many ex-Confederates watched railroads and banks squeeze small farmers into debt, Jesse turned to outlaw. To some, he was a ruthless criminal. To many poor farmers and former Southern sympathizers, he became something closer to a folk hero, a man who struck back at the powerful interests that seemed to control everything. The stories of his train robberies and bank heists spread through rural Missouri like wildfire. People gathered on front porches and around kitchen tables to repeat the latest tale. Ballads were sung in saloons and at crossroads stores. Jesse was painted as a modern Robin Hood who took from the rich and gave to the poor, even though the truth was more complicated. He was careful, paranoid, and deadly. By the early 1880s, the James Younger gang had been shattered. Most members were dead in prison or had simply disappeared. Jesse lived under the alias Thomas Howard with his wife and 2 small children in St. Joseph, trying to stay hidden while still planning what he hoped would be one last big score. He trusted almost no one. Robert Newton Ford was born into this same fractured world on December 8, 1861, in Ray County, Missouri, near the town of Richmond. He was the youngest of 7 children born to James Thomas Ford and Mary Ann Bruin Ford. The family worked a modest farm, not wealthy but respectable by the standards of the time. Ray County lay just west of the Missouri River, in a region still raw from the border troubles. Bob grew up hearing the same stories that filled every farmhouse for miles around. From the time he could sit still long enough to listen, he absorbed tales of Jesse James and the exploits of the guerrilla bands that had ridden through these very hills during the war. His father and uncles had lived through the raids and counter-raids. The names Quantrill, Anderson, and the James brothers were spoken with a mixture of fear and respect around the supper table. As a boy, Bob was wiry and quiet, the kind of child who watched more than he spoke. He helped with the chores, tended the horses, and listened. The admiration he felt for Jesse James went beyond simple hero worship. In the hardscrabble life of a Missouri farm boy, Jesse represented something larger. A man who had refused to bow to the forces that kept ordinary people poor and powerless. Bob memorized every detail he could learn. He practiced the way Jesse was said to walk and talk. He dreamed of riding beside him, of becoming part of the legend. His older brother Charlie felt some of the same pull and managed to edge his way into the outer circle of the gang first. Bob tagged along, eager for any scrap of connection. The Ford family home in Ray County was typical of the time, a simple frame house surrounded by fields and woods. Life moved to the rhythm of planting and harvest, but the shadow of the war never fully lifted. Veterans still carried bullets in their bodies and scars on their minds. Young men like Bob grew up in a culture that valued courage, loyalty, and a certain kind of defiance. Yet Bob was never the boldest or the strongest of the brothers. He was useful, reliable for small tasks, but he lacked the raw nerve that the inner circle of the gang demanded. Still, his admiration never wavered. When he finally met Jesse James in 1880 at the age of 18, it felt like stepping into the stories he had heard all his life. The meeting happened quietly, the way many things did in the shrinking remnants of the gang. Charlie had already been accepted on the fringes. Bob came along as the younger brother, the one who could hold the horses, run errands, or keep watch. Jesse allowed them both to stay close, though he never gave Bob the kind of responsibilities reserved for the trusted few. Bob did the small jobs without complaint. He curried the horses, carried messages, and stayed in the background. To outsiders, it might have looked like a minor role, but to Bob, it was everything. He was inside the circle he had idolized for years. He studied Jesse's every move, the way he scanned a room before entering, the careful way he kept his guns close, the quiet authority he carried even when the gang was reduced to a handful of men. Those early days with the gang were a strange mixture of excitement and tension. The once powerful James Younger outfit had been whittled down by deaths, arrests, and desertions. Jesse himself had become increasingly isolated, suspicious of almost everyone outside his immediate family. He tested loyalties constantly. Bob watched and learned, always careful to appear useful and loyal. He never took part in the big robberies, but he was there, part of the world he had dreamed about. The admiration he felt was genuine, almost reverent, yet something else was already stirring beneath it, a quiet hunger for the kind of recognition he knew he could never earn on his own terms. In the small, tight world of the remaining gang members, Bob Ford was still the kid brother, the hanger-on, the one who did the chores. But he was close enough to touch the legend, and that closeness would change everything. Life in rural Missouri in those years was not easy. Farms struggled under debt to the same railroads and banks Jesse targeted. Families remembered the war in the lines on their faces and the empty chairs at the table. Bob's own family had survived the chaos, but the stories of what had happened to neighbors and relatives were passed down like family heirlooms. In that atmosphere, it was easy for a young man to see Jesse James as more than a criminal. He was a symbol of resistance, a man who had taken control of his own fate when the world tried to dictate it. Bob absorbed that idea deeply. He carried it with him every day he rode with the remnants of the gang. He wanted to belong, to prove himself, to step out of the shadow and into the light of the same kind of fame. Yet the reality of outlaw life was harsher and more uncertain than the ballads suggested. There were long nights on the run, constant fear of betrayal, and the knowledge that one mistake could end everything. Bob saw it all up close. He watched Jesse grow more cautious, more isolated. He saw how quickly trust could evaporate. And in the quiet moments between jobs when the men sat around a fire or in a safe house, Bob listened to the stories Jesse told about the war and the early days of the gang. Those conversations only deepened the young man's fascination. Jesse became more than a leader to him. He became the embodiment of everything Bob wanted to be and knew. Deep down, he never quite could. The Missouri countryside that had shaped both men was a land of rolling hills, thick woods, and rivers that could flood without warning. Ray County, where Bob was born and raised, lay in the heart of Little Dixie, a region settled by Southern families who brought their traditions and their politics with them. The soil was good for corn and tobacco, but the years after the war brought economic hardship that made many young men restless. Bob was no exception. Entirely rejecting a quiet lifetime of plowing fields and worrying about crop prices, he succumbed completely to the overpowering pull of the outlaw life and its promise of excitement. His admiration for Jesse gave him a direction, a purpose. It also planted the first quiet seeds of something darker, a desire to be remembered that would one day twist into something unrecognizable. By the time Bob turned 20, the gang had shrunk to a core group that included the Ford brothers on its outer edge. Jesse still planned carefully, but the circle of people he could rely on had grown dangerously small. Bob remained in the background, doing what was asked of him, always watching. He had come a long way from the farm boy listening to stories around the kitchen table. He was inside the legend now, breathing the same air, sharing the same risks. Yet the gap between hero and admirer never closed. Bob could ride with Jesse, eat with him, laugh at his jokes, but he was never truly his equal. That knowledge sat inside him like a stone, growing heavier with every passing month. The boy who had once worshipped from afar was now close enough to see the cracks in the armor, close enough to imagine what it might feel like to step out of the shadow and claim a piece of the spotlight for himself. Rather than the beginning of his story, the morning of April 3rd, 1882, served as the exact irreversible point where everything he had lived for violently converged. The quiet parlor, the crooked picture, the turned back, the single shot, none of it happened by accident. It was the end result of years spent in the shadow of a man he both loved and envied. The world outside that house would soon learn the name Robert Newton Ford, but not in the way he had once dreamed. The legend he helped end would outlive him, and the shadow he stepped into that morning would follow him for the rest of his days. The days inside the shrinking circle of the James gang were a grinding mix of boredom and sharp-edged tension that tested every man's nerves. Bob Ford learned quickly that outlaw life was far less glamorous than the fireside tales he had grown up hearing. There were weeks spent in damp caves or abandoned farmhouses, waiting for the next move while the law tightened its net around Missouri. Jesse had become a master of disguise and evasion, changing names and routes with the precision of a man who knew one slip would end him. Bob's role remained practical and unglamorous. He tended the horses at night so they stayed quiet, carried supplies on foot when wagons were too risky, and stood watch during the long pre-dawn hours when everyone else tried to snatch a few hours of sleep. He never complained, but he noticed how Jesse handed the dangerous jobs to others while keeping Bob on the edges, useful but never essential. Jesse treated the Ford brothers differently from the start. Charlie earned a measure of real respect because he had proven himself in small ways during the earlier rides. Bob, though, remained the younger tag-along, the one Jesse would send for extra cartridges or to scout a back trail. In the quiet hours around campfires, Bob studied every gesture Jesse made, the way he cleaned his guns with slow, deliberate strokes, the short laugh he gave when a plan came together, the sudden silence that fell when he sensed danger. Bob began copying those habits in small ways, the tilt of his hat, the way he rested his hand near his pistol even when there was no threat. He wanted to absorb the essence of the man, to become someone others would speak about in the same hushed tones. Yet the more time he spent close to Jesse, the clearer it became that the gap between them was not just one of age or experience. Jesse possessed a natural authority born from years of command and survival. Bob had only admiration and a growing unspoken frustration that he could never quite match it. The gang's numbers had dwindled to a handful by late 1881. Men who had once ridden boldly were either dead, locked away, or had chosen safer lives. Jesse's paranoia grew with each loss. He tested loyalties with sudden questions, watching faces for the slightest flicker of doubt. Bob passed every test, offering quick answers and steady eyes, but inside he felt the weight of being watched. He knew he was tolerated more than trusted, and that knowledge ate at him during the long rides between hideouts. He wanted more than errands and horse duty. He wanted the kind of stories that would be told about him one day, the kind that made strangers nod in recognition. The admiration he once felt pure and bright had begun to curdle into something sharper, a hunger that mixed love with resentment. Jesse represented everything Bob desired and everything he suspected he could never become on his own. The breaking point arrived in January 1882 at the isolated farmhouse of Bob's widowed sister, Martha Bolton, in Ray County. Several gang members had gathered there for a few days of relative safety while Jesse scouted new possibilities farther west. Among them was Wood Height, Jesse's own first cousin, a tall, hot-tempered man who had ridden with the gang for years. Also present was Dick Little, another longtime associate who had recently fallen out with parts of the group. The house was crowded, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed clothes. Tensions had been simmering for days over small disagreements about money and past jobs. On the morning of the 23rd, the argument exploded over breakfast. Words flew, then pistols cleared leather. Little took a bullet in the leg and dropped. Woodhite, bleeding from a graze on his arm, kept firing wildly. In the chaos that followed, Bob stepped forward and fired a single decisive shot that struck Woodhite in the head. The man crumpled without another sound, operating without a fraction of a second of hesitation. Bob wrapped the body in a blanket and loaded it onto a mule and led the animal deep into the surrounding woods. There, in a shallow grave dug with a borrowed shovel, he buried Jesse's cousin and covered the spot with leaves and brush so no one would easily find it. The act was cold and practical, but it changed everything inside Bob. He had just killed a blood relative of the man he idolized. If Jesse ever learned the truth, there would be no mercy, no second chance. The fear settled in Bob's chest like a stone that grew heavier each day. At the same time, a new calculation began to form. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The same hands that had once held Jesse's gifted revolver in admiration had now taken a life connected to him. Bob realized that the fastest path to the recognition he craved might not lie in following Jesse, but in ending him. The thought was shocking at first. Then it settled into something almost logical. If he could not become the hero, perhaps he could become the man who stopped the hero. Word of Woodhite's disappearance spread quietly through the remaining gang members, but no one connected it directly to Bob yet. Jesse asked questions, his eyes sharp and searching, but Bob met them with calm denials and offers to help search. The fear of discovery pushed Bob to act faster than he had planned. He knew the governor of Missouri, Thomas Crittenden, had made public offers of rewards for information leading to the capture or death of the James brothers. Bob arranged a secret meeting through careful intermediaries, traveling alone at night to avoid detection. The encounter took place in a private room in a Jefferson City hotel, far from prying eyes. Governor Crittenden sat across a plain wooden table listening without interruption as Bob laid out his proposal. He would deliver Jesse James, dead or alive, in exchange for a full pardon, covering every crime he and Charlie had ever committed, plus the $10,000 reward that had been posted. Bypassing any lengthy hesitation, the governor instantly struck the deal with a handshake and a binding promise of absolute secrecy. Bob left the meeting with papers hidden in his coat and a clear path forward. He returned to the gang's loose network and began the careful work of positioning himself and Charlie closer to Jesse than ever before. They offered to help with small tasks, volunteered for scouting runs, and gradually made themselves indispensable in the daily routines of survival. Jesse, increasingly isolated and wary of everyone else, began to rely on the Ford brothers more and more. He invited them to stay at his rented house in St. Joseph under the alias Thomas Howard, a modest place on Lafayette Street, where he lived quietly with his wife Zerelda and their 2 young children. The house became the stage for the final act of deception. Bob and Charlie moved in as supposed cousins, sharing meals at the same table, sleeping in the same rooms, and helping with household chores. Jesse's children took to them immediately. Bob would lift the little boy onto his knee and bounce him while telling harmless stories, all the while feeling the weight of the revolver he kept hidden and loaded. Zerelda cooked for them and treated them like family, unaware that the young men laughing at her table had already struck a bargain with the state to destroy her husband. Jesse himself relaxed in their presence in a way he had not done with others in years. He spoke openly about future plans, shared memories of the war, and even gave Bob small gifts, including the very Colt revolver that would later be used against him. The trust was complete, and Bob nurtured it daily with careful words and steady behavior. He never pushed, never showed the slightest sign of impatience. Inside, however, the mixture of fear and ambition had hardened into a cold resolve. Life in the St. Joseph house followed a quiet domestic rhythm that masked the tension beneath. Mornings began with breakfast together, Jesse discussing the weather or small repairs needed around the property. Afternoons might involve light work in the yard or quiet conversations on the porch while the children played nearby. Evenings ended with cards or stories told around the lamp. Bob and Charlie played their parts perfectly, laughing at the right moments, offering help before it was asked, and never giving Jesse any reason to doubt them. The children's laughter became a constant background to the deception, a reminder of the ordinary life Jesse was trying to build, even as he planned one more big job. Bob watched it all with a strange detachment, noting every habit, every moment when Jesse's guard slipped. He learned the exact way Jesse hung his gun belt each night, the side of the bed he preferred, the small rituals that made the man human rather than legendary. The weeks in the house stretched into a delicate balance of normalcy and dread. Bob felt the pressure of the secret deal growing heavier with each passing day. He knew the governor expected results soon, and any delay could unravel the agreement. Charlie shared the strain, though the two brothers rarely spoke of it directly for fear of being overheard. They communicated in glances and coded phrases when they were alone for brief moments. Bob spent long nights lying awake, listening to the house settle, calculating the best opportunity. He weighed the risks of waiting too long against the danger of acting too soon. The fear of Jesse discovering the truth about Woodhite never left him, but it had transformed into a strange kind of fuel. Every smile he gave Jesse, every helpful gesture, was now part of a larger performance that would end in one irreversible moment. Outside the house, the wider world continued its ordinary business. Street. Joseph was a growing town with trains arriving daily, shops opening, and people going about their lives unaware that one of the most wanted men in America lived quietly among them. Bob moved through the streets on small errands for Jesse, always careful to maintain the appearance of a loyal relative. He bought supplies, posted letters, and listened for any rumor that might indicate the law was closing in from another direction. The double life sharpened his senses and deepened his isolation. He could trust no one, not even his brother, completely, because one wrong word could destroy the plan. The admiration that had once filled him with warmth now felt like a chain, binding him to the very man he had decided to betray. As March gave way to early April, the opportunity Bob had been waiting for began to take shape. Jesse spoke more openly about restlessness and the need for action. The household routine remained steady, but small signs showed that Jesse's patience was wearing thin. Bob noted each detail, storing it away like pieces of a puzzle that would soon fit together. The house at 1318 Lafayette Street had become both sanctuary and trap, and Bob understood that the next few days would decide everything. He and Charlie prepared in silence, checking their weapons when no one was looking, rehearsing their escape route in their minds. The governor's promise waited in the background, a future of safety and money that seemed both close and impossibly distant. The boy who had once listened to outlaw stories around his family's kitchen table had traveled a long and winding road to this moment, and every step had led him here, to the quiet house where the legend would finally meet its end at the hands of the man who had once worshipped it most. The plan was set, the pieces were in place, and the only thing left was the right morning, the right unguarded instant when Jesse's back would be turned and the long shadow of admiration would finally give way to something darker and more permanent. Bob Ford had crossed every line that mattered, and there was no turning back. The tension in the rented house on Lafayette Street had become a living thing by the final days of March, pressing against the walls and making every creak of the floorboards feel loaded with meaning. Bob Ford moved through the ordinary routines with a surface calm that hid the storm building inside him, sharing meals where Jesse discussed the coming bank job in Platte City, as if it were just another day's work. The children's laughter echoed in the small rooms, while Bob bounced the little boy on his knee and told light stories that masked the weight of the revolver he kept close at all times. Charlie kept his own counsel and quiet glances across the table, the two brothers communicating in the smallest nods and shifts of posture that only they understood. Jesse spoke more freely now, sharing fragments of old war memories or plans for the future that carried an undercurrent of restlessness, as if the quiet domestic life was starting to chafe against the man who had spent years on the run. Bob listened intently, filing away every detail, every habit that might reveal a moment of complete vulnerability, while the secret agreement with the governor sat like a coiled spring in the back of his mind. Mornings in the house followed a steady rhythm that felt almost too normal for the stakes involved. Breakfast was simple fare prepared by Zerelda, with coffee strong enough to cut through the spring chill, and bread still warm from the oven. Jesse would sit at the head of the table mapping out the details of the upcoming robbery in low tones, outlining escape routes and timing, while Bob and Charlie nodded along as loyal cousins helping with the work. Afternoons might bring light chores around the property or quiet conversations on the porch where the children played in the yard, their voices a constant reminder of the ordinary life Jesse was trying to carve out, even as he prepared for one more score. Bob participated in all of it with careful precision, offering to run errands into town or help mend a fence, always positioning himself as the reliable younger relative who asked no awkward questions. Yet in the quiet hours after the lamps were turned low, when the house settled into sleep, Bob lay awake, tracing the lines of the deal he had made, weighing the promise of safety and money against the growing realization that this path would close every other door behind him forever. The final evening before everything changed carried an edge of anticipation that Bob could feel in his bones. Jesse reviewed the plans one last time over supper, his voice steady as he outlined the roles each man would play in the Platte City job, unaware that the Ford brothers had already committed to a different ending. Zerelda cleared the dishes with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had grown accustomed to uncertainty, while the children were tucked into bed with stories that Bob helped tell. The air in the parlor felt thicker than usual as the men sat for a last pipe before turning in, Jesse speaking of the need for one big haul to set his family up properly and leave the old life behind. Bob offered agreeable comments at the right moments, his face a mask of support. But inside the conflict churned between the boy who had once idolized this man and the man who now saw the quickest route to his own place in history. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by the sound of the house settling and the distant whistle of a train that seemed to carry the weight of the world outside. Dawn on the 3rd of April broke clear and warmer than expected, the kind of spring morning that promised renewal but delivered something far different. The household stirred with the usual routines, coffee brewing and breakfast prepared while Jesse outlined the final preparations for the day's work. Bob and Charlie moved with deliberate care, aware that every second now counted toward the moment they had prepared for in silence. The children played nearby as the men finished their meal, the normalcy of the scene contrasting sharply with the decision that hung in the air unspoken. Jesse rose from the table with a comment about the heat building already, removing his gun belt and setting the revolvers aside in a gesture that spoke of complete ease in the company of the two men he had come to rely on. He noticed the framed piece of needlework his mother had stitched hanging crooked on the wall and decided it needed straightening before they left for the day. Bob watched the moment unfold with a clarity that sharpened every sense. The click of the hammer on his own weapon sounding unnaturally loud in the still room as he drew and fired in one fluid motion. Jesse started to turn at the sound, but the bullet found its mark with deadly precision, and the legend of the outlaw ended in the quiet parlor of a rented house on an ordinary Tuesday. Zerelda's scream cut through the house as she rushed in from the next room, her voice raw with shock and disbelief as she knelt beside her husband's body. Completely abandoning any thought of explanations or farewells, Bob and Charlie instantly bolted through the back door and cleared the fence in a single bound, and began shouting the news to the neighbors in voices that carried down the street and into the morning air. The words, "We've killed Jesse James," echoed as they ran toward the telegraph office, where the message was sent to the governor confirming the deed and claiming the reward that had been promised. The immediate aftermath unfolded in a blur of official procedures that exposed the careful arrangement behind the killing. Bob and Charlie surrendered themselves to authorities almost immediately, their statements prepared and consistent as they recounted the events in the parlor. Word spread through street. Joseph like wildfire, drawing crowds to the house and the telegraph lines, humming with the news across the state. Zerelda's identification of the body as her husband, Jesse Woodson James, was confirmed by distinctive scars from Civil War wounds, including a bullet that had never fully healed, leaving no doubt for those who needed proof. The Ford brothers were taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. The courtroom in St. Joseph filling with spectators eager to see the men who had ended the reign of the most famous outlaw in America. The trial itself was swift, lasting only a single day on April 17th, as evidence was presented and the brothers stood before the judge. They were found guilty and sentenced to hang, the gavel falling with finality in a packed room where the air felt heavy with the weight of history. Yet the pardon came with breathtaking speed, exactly as the governor had arranged in the private agreement struck months earlier. Within 2 hours of the sentencing, Governor Thomas Crittenden signed the full pardons that covered every crime the Ford brothers had ever committed, including the earlier killing that had set the chain of events in motion. The state had used the young men to eliminate a persistent problem without the expense or risk of a prolonged manhunt, and the papers were processed with efficient precision that left little room for public debate in the moment. The reward money, however, proved far less than promised. The $10,000 that had been the carrot in the deal dwindled through bureaucratic channels in official hands until Bob and Charlie received only a fraction, somewhere around $500 each, a bitter reminder that even sanctioned betrayal came with its own costs and disappointments. The public reaction hit like a wave that neither brother had fully anticipated, turning what they expected to be heroic acclaim into something far darker and more lasting. Newspapers across the country carried the story in bold headlines, but the tone shifted quickly from celebration of an outlaw's end to condemnation of the method used to achieve it. Jesse James had captured the imagination of ordinary people as a symbol of resistance against powerful interests, and the manner of his death, shot while unarmed and tending to a simple household task, struck many as cowardly rather than courageous. Ballads began circulating almost immediately in saloons and crossroads gatherings, the most enduring one painting the picture in stark terms that would follow Bob Ford for the rest of his life. The verses spoke of Jesse as a man with a hand and a heart and a brain who robbed the rich to give to the poor, then turned on the killer with the damning chorus that labeled him the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave. The song spread through oral tradition and printed broadsides, embedding the judgment deep into American folklore, where it would echo for generations. Bob and Charlie tried to turn the notoriety into income by appearing in a stage show called Outlaws of Missouri, reenacting the events of that April morning for paying audiences who came out of curiosity but often left in hostility. The performances drew crowds at first, but the reactions grew uglier with each town, audiences booing and throwing objects as the brothers portrayed the very act that had made them infamous. Charlie struggled visibly under the strain, his health already fragile from the tuberculosis that had begun to rack his body with persistent coughs and weakness. The guilt compounded the physical toll, and the morphine he turned to for relief only deepened the downward spiral as he battled both the disease and the nightmares that came with it. By early 1884, barely 2 years after the killing, Charlie could no longer bear the weight. He retreated to the family home in Richmond, Missouri, where on May 6th he took his own life with a gunshot to the chest, leaving behind a note of despair and a widow who had married him only the year before. The coroner's jury noted his habitual use of morphine and the consuming illness that had left him a shell of the man who had once ridden with the gang. Bob stood over the coffin in silence when a reporter arrived, offering only a few quiet words about not knowing what he would do now that his brother was gone. Left alone, Bob Ford drifted westward in search of a new start that never quite materialized. He spent time in Las Vegas, New Mexico, trying his hand at various ventures before the pull of the silver boom drew him to Creede, Colorado, in the early 1890s. At 28, he still looked younger than his years, and he poured what money he had into building a 2-story saloon and gambling hall called the Creede Exchange on the main street. The business prospered at first in the rough mining camp, with Bob running the faro table and attracting the lawless element that thrived in such boom towns. He married a woman named Dottie and tried to settle into a semblance of normal life upstairs from the bar, but the past followed him in whispers and stares from those who recognized the name. The paranoia that had once driven him to act now turned inward, making him jumpy and quick-tempered as he carried weapons everywhere and scanned every face for signs of threat. Life in Creede grew increasingly unstable as the town's rough character clashed with Bob's own demons. He was asked to leave once after a drunken episode where he shot out streetlights and windows in a fit of rage, forcing a brief stay in Pueblo before he was allowed back. When a fire swept through the business district and destroyed much of the town, Bob salvaged what he could, including a baby grand piano, and rebuilt in a large tent that served as a temporary dance hall and saloon while he waited to construct something permanent. The tent became his world, divided into sections for gambling, drinking, and living quarters in the rear. He managed the bar with a heavy hand, drinking more as the years wore on, and the shadow of his past grew longer rather than shorter. Customers came for the thrill of saying they had shared a drink with the man who killed Jesse James, but many left with stories of his volatility and the way he seemed forever on edge, convinced that someone would eventually try to claim the same kind of fame he had once sought. The end came on June 8, 1892, almost exactly 10 years after the morning in St. Joseph. Edward O'Kelly, a hot-tempered miner with connections that some later speculated tied back to old gang sympathies, walked into the tent saloon while Bob was sweeping the floor with his back to the entrance. O'Kelly called out clearly, "Hello, Bob," forcing the moment of recognition that Bob had always feared. As Bob turned to face the voice, O'Kelly raised a double-barreled shotgun and fired both loads into his neck at close range. The blast was instantaneous and fatal, ending Bob Ford's life in the same sudden way he had ended Jesse's, though this time face-to-face rather than from behind. Witnesses described the scene as chaotic in the moments after, with O'Kelly standing over the body as the tent filled with the smell of powder and blood. O'Kelly was arrested immediately and charged with murder, his trial drawing intense local attention in the mining camp. The public sentiment, however, leaned heavily in his favor from the start. More than 7,000 people signed a petition demanding his release, viewing the killing as a form of rough justice that balanced the scales for the earlier betrayal. O'Kelly was initially sentenced to life but saw it reduced to 18 years, and he ultimately served only about 9 before being freed on medical grounds and the weight of public pressure. Refusing to ever offer a clear motive for the act, O'Kelly permanently left historians and storytellers to endlessly speculate on grudges, fame, or simple opportunism in a lawless town. Bob's body was buried first in Creed with a funeral attended by his gambling associates, then later exhumed and returned to Richmond, Missouri for reburial near family. The gravestone was simple, carrying only the stark identification that he was the man who had shot Jesse James, with no elaborate eulogy or words of forgiveness. The graves of both men tell their own quiet stories in the years since. Jesse's marker in Kearney, Missouri, carries inscriptions that reflect the complex legacy of a man seen by some as hero and others as villain, while Bob's final resting place remains plain and unadorned, a reminder of the cost of the path he chose. The ballad that damned him as the dirty little coward continued to be sung in saloons and passed down through generations, embedding the judgment so deeply that it outlived the men themselves. In the broader sweep of American history, the story became a lens through which people examined the fragile line between admiration and envy, between justice and vengeance, in a frontier that rewarded boldness but punished betrayal with a particular kind of enduring shame. The quiet morning in St. Joseph did more than end a life. It immortalized a legend and cursed the man who ended it. Bob Ford sought to step out of Jesse James's shadow, but instead he purchased a lifetime of infamy for a fraction of the promised reward. While Jesse's grave became a monument to a frontier rebel, Bob's legacy was forever cemented in the bitter chorus of a saloon ballad, the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. It stands as the American West's most enduring cautionary tale. The price of trading loyalty for a fleeting moment of fame is a darkness that never truly lifts.